Hi, it's been a while since I posted a video. For those who don't know me, I'm Ken Munshine. I'm an academic medieval historian as well as a fencing master, a jouster, a hemaist, and a number of other things. So I kind of hit a bunch of communities here who I think will be interested in the subject I'm going to talk about, which is the current controversy in academic medieval studies, which is for a large part a personality conflict between two individuals. And I don't want to get into that and who did what, but rather I kind of want to talk about the meta argument behind that and also people's reaction to that, especially the popular reaction to that, which is spurred on by a very interesting email to the MEDIEV-L mailing list, which I'll share with you in a moment. Um, for Earlier on MEDIEV-L, I had posted that a large part of this conflict, which has to do with the idea of social justice in medieval studies and both making medieval studies a fairer place, but also questioning how we do medieval history and what this medieval history says and what the repercussions of that are for social justice and anti-fascism and a bunch of other concerns that are especially relevant today with the rise of the alt-right. Especially things that I've myself spoken about, such as medieval history being used as a symbol by the alt-right. So I posted that also that a large part of this controversy that's going on is not only about that, but also about two different ways of looking at history, of doing history, or epistemologies, if you would. For those who don't know, epistemology is the way of looking at way of looking at the world, and historiography is the study of history, why historians write what they write about and how we write about history. So I wrote that it's really a conflict between a theory-driven way of looking at history, that is one that looks at it in terms of things like gender theory, race theory, intersectionalism, which says that you look at the world both as, for me, for instance, both as a male and also as a white male, as an American white male, and all this colors my epistemology and my worldview and would color my way of looking at history. In the same way, tends to be a very activist. This is a very activist way of looking at the world, and it's very much an epistemology of critique, that we need to look at medieval history and the way medieval history has been done as very often serving maybe some nefarious ends, for putting a certain group at the top of society's power hierarchy and maintaining that there. And even the questions that we historians ask are to some degree tainted by this. The other way of looking at the world, which is this way is in conflict with, is the older one, which is more document-driven, evidence-driven, looking at maybe how people in medieval history looked at their own world in their own context, or at least attempting to, or at least on the face, looking at that, at their contexts and things like that. But of course, as I mentioned, that the questions you're going to ask are always going to be shaped by who you are and where you're coming from. So that brings me to this email, which is really interesting because I think it's an opinion that's shared by a lot of reenactors, a lot of medieval martial artists, people in the Western martial arts community, and a lot of people who are simply medieval history buffs. And I'm not going to say the contributor's name, but I'll read from their email. And I quote, "We ought to keep medieval history discussing events and ideas from medieval times, and not attribute everything that happened in medieval times to modern ideas, such as racism and misogyny and feminism." I read in the Medieval Middle blog, the posters talk exclusively about racism and misogyny and feminism, all perfectly legitimate topics by themselves, but I don't think they have anything to do with medieval history. Medievals goes on to say medievals had their own issues, such as divine right of kings, rights of the clergy, powers of the pope, witchcraft, relics of saints, etc. we should not explain the Middle Ages by citing 21st century concepts. We should discuss the Middle Ages in terms of medieval concepts. And then they go on to say the Middle Ages were a colorful and romantic time, especially in literature and Hollywood movies. If modern groups want to draw on the romance and color, I don't see what we can do about it, save some debunking after the fact. Free speech, you know. Well, this poster certainly has got some very, very good points in what they say, right? That obviously we can't police people. Though we, of course, should be worried if people are using medieval symbology for political ends that might not be so socially productive, right? Certainly we should worry about that. But I want to draw attention to what they said first about the looking back through a lens of modern theory, which is to say modern activist concerns. And I'm going to give two answers as to why people do this, and why this is important. One is going to be a completely cynical answer, and the other one is going to be more of an activist answer. First, the cynical one. If you think about academic medieval historians, I mean, how do we make a living, right? I don't produce any wealth. All I do is I teach people about history. I also teach them fencing, right? But let's take my purely academic function for a moment. I don't generate wealth, right? But someone's got to pay me. So what purpose do I serve in society? Well, history is written by the victors, isn't it? History, the study of history, has always served to bolster a certain worldview, a certain epistemological frame. So if I'm living in the 19th century and I'm a medieval historian, and the greatest good to me is the rise of the nation state, right? The rise of the political community of the modern state, the modern country, right? Then my greatest concern is looking back in the Middle Ages for the origins of the eternal France or the eternal Germany, with the idea that yes, it is good that we have this political organization. It's going to serve the needs of those who are in power. If I am a Marxist in the 60s, say I'm a 60s radical, I'm looking back at the Middle Ages at workers' movements. I'm going to look at the English peasants' rebellion. I'm going to look at the revolt of the Chianti, things I covered today in class, that are going to be, to me, proto-Marxist, perhaps, proto-proletarian revolutions. And likewise today, well, what's our big concern? Our big concern, right, our shibboleth is diversity. What is diversity, for a second? Diversity is essentially a political argument. It says that access to resources should not be limited by the color of your skin, your gender expression, etc. It says that but like everybody should participate equally in society and have equal access to power and wealth. Of course, because society is inherently unequal, societies will always be inherently unequal, because societies will always be political, which means some people get more resources than other people. This is to some degree something I'm very cynical about, because there's always going to be a hierarchy of power, and there's always going to be a hierarchy of who gets what resources. But diversity is, at least, on the face of it, trying to upend this. So if that is our God today, right? If this is just in the same way, and by which I mean, in the same way that people in the Middle Ages condemned heretical propositions in universities, right? But if that is our theology today, if that is our worldview that we're going to defend, that is my job to do. To look for a diversity in the Middle Ages, because that's what historians do, right? This is what's going to lead to medieval history posts being funded in universities and people getting jobs. And it's not by coincidence that really most of the jobs that we're seeing posted, or many of them at least, want a transnational view. They want someone who can do a multicultural Middle Ages. And this is value neutral. This is just the way it is, okay? So that's our job. The second thing is that, well, look at what I said at the very beginning of this video. The concerns that we write about are always going to be colored by who we are. So our poster talks about medieval, about it being a romantic time and the portrayal of that. And for many people, it's simply romantic. Clearly, this speaks to them. But people say, in Hema, it shouldn't be about politics. It should just be about sword fighting. It shouldn't be about trying to understand the Middle Ages in those terms. It should be in the terms of modern feminism, modern race theory. but it should be about understanding their terms. But, well, two things. One, I think it's kind of like taking the red pill in the Matrix, not the Reddit forum, the red pill, but I mean the waking up, that once you start seeing systematic inequalities in things, which you get by reading critical theory, then it's really hard not to see them. Just the same way if you undergraduate, you read Marxism, everything kind of looks Marxist to you, and it's the same way if you read Ayn Rand, everything looks kind of objectivist to you. But still, I mean, these are very this is no less an epistemology. And if we're going to fulfill the first function, which is creating a more just world, then we need to kind of look at how we're looking at the Middle Ages as well, and how we're using them. And of course, people are using the Middle Ages, such as the marchers in Charlottesville, using runes and medieval imagery of various sorts. They're using it in a way that perhaps wouldn't be in accordance with academic medievalists. That's an important thing. And then, well, can it just be about sword fighting? Yes, of course it can be, but this tends to be placed on a lower hierarchical level than real history, which has got the political involvement, at least by the academy. And then, of course, we need to be careful because, I mean, medieval knights, medieval sword fighting, the romance and chivalry of the Middle Ages, this also has the propensity for being turned into a symbol. And you can say, well, I wasn't aware that that symbol meant something or was being appropriated by these other people to mean something. But unfortunately, everything is political, and things do get turned into political symbols, despite the fact we might not wish them to be so. So that's another thing, that we do have to be aware of the uses and the misuses of the things that we use. But most importantly, I think that if we look at the field of academic medieval history in and of itself, we realize that there are some systemic inequalities in it, and also, more importantly, if we just because we're not talking here about the structure of the profession of medieval history, but rather about medieval history itself, we need to look at a lot of the things that we look at, a lot of the histories that we read, are not value neutral in and of themselves, and that we need to interrogate why they're being written, why historians ask the questions that they do. Okay? Today the questions are about diversity, but if you're let's look at a classic work of medieval military history, Sir Charles Oman's books on medieval warfare. I mean, he writes with a certain assumption. You can't understand a historian's work and their interpretation of the past unless you understand their frame. And so what a large amount of what this activism is about interrogating the frame. And it's very, very important to do, because ultimately by interrogating our frame and knowing more about ourselves and why we're asking the questions that we're asking, ultimately I think we're going to be doing better history by this, which does not absolve us of the need to have a complete and total mastery of the source material. You must, so my conclusion in this, of course, is that both models of history are necessary and have a lot to recommend them. In the first place, you must have sort of the old school complete understanding of your languages, your materials, your sources, and what these meant in the context of the people who lived that. On the other hand, you have to explain that to the present, right? We don't live in a vacuum. We don't live in the past. We are not medieval people. Sorry, Society for Creative Anachronism, you are not medieval people. And so you have to take the one to the other. And you have to remember that we're always looking through a lens, and you need to look at how your lens is distorted if you're going to do good history. So I think, historiographically at least, both sides in this debate have got valid things to say. The social justice issues, we can leave for another time, and the political associations. But stripping those away and simply looking at the epistemological debate, I think it's important that we listen to both ideas. Thank you.